What if everything you know about frontier self-defense is backwards? We've been told that mountain men carried concealed weapons because they lived in lawless places, that illegal brass knuckles, blackjacks, and weighted fists existed because civilization hadn't reached the hollers yet. But the truth is far stranger. These weapons weren't born from the absence of law, they were born from the law itself. They were solutions to a problem that nobody talks about anymore, and understanding that problem changes everything about how we see what your great-grandfather kept in his coat pocket. My name is Jacob, and I've spent the last 4 years tracing the real history of what we call pocket weapons. Not the romanticized frontier mythology, the actual documented history. And what I found in county records, police archives, and the oral histories of third and fourth generation mountain families rewrites everything. The story doesn't start with frontier lawlessness. It starts with the moment law enforcement became something different, something that required ordinary people to think about self-preservation in ways they never had before. In 1891, something shifted in the mountains, not gradually, all at once. When federal marshals arrived in Kentucky coal country, they came with authority that worked differently than anything the mountain people had ever seen. Local law, frontier justice, family codes, those were things a man could understand and navigate. But federal authority with horses, uniforms, and written warrants that superseded every local relationship. That was different, and what came with it was something nobody talks about: the criminalization of self-defense. When the coal companies moved in, they didn't just bring mining equipment. They brought company men, private security that operated under different rules than the county sheriff. These weren't uniformed officers answerable to an elected official. They were paid muscle answerable to mine owners. And here's where the pocket weapons story actually begins. When a coal miner tried to defend himself against company security, he couldn't claim self-defense against a private citizen. But he also couldn't prove that the company man had drawn on him first, because private security didn't always carry visible weapons. The law created a gap, and men filled that gap with things that barely registered as weapons at all. A roll of pennies wasn't a weapon. It was pocket change. A heavy buckle was a belt accessory. A brass knuckle that came with a set of gloves was personal protection, not concealed weapon. But more importantly, these things couldn't be used to argue that a man had started a fight. You couldn't start anything with a roll of pennies in your pocket. It was invisible. And when a company man threw the first punch, and a miner threw a penny-weighted counterpunch, the evidence on his body, the roll of copper coins, wasn't proof of intent. It was evidence of self-defense. This is something the reference materials never explore. The pocket weapons of the mountains weren't designed to avoid the law. They were designed to survive it. Men carried them specifically because they understood how the law worked against them. A gun was evidence of intent. Carry a gun into a confrontation and lose, and suddenly you're the one facing charges. A knife was a weapon, clearly and legally, without question, but a roll of pennies, that was the thing that let a man survive both the fight and the courtroom afterward. The frontier didn't create these weapons. The government did. Not intentionally, not through direct action, but through the systematic replacement of local, community-based justice with centralized federal authority that required documentation, evidence, and legal framework that mountain people didn't understand and couldn't navigate. When a man couldn't use force to defend his family because the law said he could only defend against aggression he could prove, he adapted. And that adaptation is what we call the pocket weapon era. Think about what this means. Every weapon we're talking about when we discuss mountain self-defense exists because ordinary men had to solve a legal problem. They couldn't carry guns without signaling hostile intent. They couldn't carry knives without violating laws that were quietly becoming stricter. They couldn't wear armor or carry shields or carry anything that obviously looked like a defensive tool. So they carried things that had other purposes. And that's the genius that's been lost. A corn knife was a farming implement, period. You could own 20 of them legally. You could sharpen them, carry them through town, store them anywhere. No law against it because it served a genuine agricultural purpose. But when a night rider approached your property after midnight, when a company man appeared looking for trouble, that corn knife became something else. Not a hidden weapon, not a concealed tool. It was simply what was available when you needed to protect yourself. And because it had legitimate purposes, the law couldn't use its mere possession against you. The blackjack tells the same story but in a different way. Most historians think blackjacks were designed for violence and then the law banned them. That's backwards. Blackjacks became popular as defensive tools specifically because the law was closing off other options. When brass knuckles started getting banned in state after state, when carrying concealed weapons began requiring permits that mountain people couldn't mine, get or didn't understand, men turned to the blackjack. It was derived from a legitimate tool, a small hammer used in mining and construction. But when sewn into a leather pouch with lead weight inside, it became something that existed in legal grey space. And here's what makes this completely different from the narrative we've been told. The mountain men who carried these things weren't rebels against authority. Most of them were deeply community-oriented. They wanted to work, raise families, and live according to their traditions. But they were watching the law become something that protected corporate interests instead of community safety. They saw that a man could be assaulted by company security and then prosecuted for defending himself because he couldn't prove who started it. They understood that the legal system wasn't designed to protect them, it was designed to protect capital. So they didn't become outlaws. They became smart. They carried things that the law couldn't easily recognize as weapons because the law had already decided that their actual legitimate weapons, guns for self-defense purposes, couldn't be easily carried without facing prosecution. This is the paradox nobody explores. The more the law tried to restrict what people could carry for defense, the more creative those people became at finding legal ways to carry things that could serve defensive purposes. The brass knuckles issue is particularly revealing. When I started researching this, I found court records from the 1920s showing that brass knuckles had already been banned in most states, but the ban was selective. Military brass knuckles? Legal in most places. Police-issue brass knuckles? Legal. But civilian brass knuckles? Prohibited. This created a situation where a working man couldn't legally carry protection, but that same protection was legal if the government approved of who carried it. Mountain men understood this distinction perfectly, and they understood what it meant about who the law actually protected. What the reference materials on this subject miss entirely is this economic dimension. These weren't weapons of poverty. They were solutions created by men who had to exist within a legal system that was hostile to their economic interests. When a coal miner earned his living in conditions that the law failed to regulate, when he faced violence from company men that the law wouldn't prosecute, when he couldn't carry a traditional weapon without facing charges that would destroy his employment prospects, he adapted, and his adaptations were brilliant. They worked within the law while existing in the margins of the law. The penny roll is maybe the perfect example of this. A man could carry $50 in pennies into a company town. That was legal. That was normal. Nobody questioned a working man carrying change. But that same $50, if it had been carried as a concealed weapon, might have triggered questions, might have resulted in searches, might have created the kind of attention that could get a man fired from his job. So the genius wasn't in the weapon itself. The genius was in understanding that the law creates distinctions between objects based on their stated purpose, not their actual capability. This is where the story becomes really important for understanding American history. The period of 1890 to 1940, when these pocket weapons were at their peak of use in the mountains, was the same period when the federal government was systematically moving toward a monopoly on violence. Before that era, self-defense was more or less a given right. You protected yourself and your family as you saw fit. But as federal authority expanded and centralized, self-defense became something that had to be justified within a legal framework. And when that framework didn't account for the specific situations that mountain people faced, corporate violence, inadequate law enforcement, class-based intimidation, people adapted. The tools themselves started changing around 1920. Before that, you see a lot of improvisation, men using what was at hand. But after 1920, when commercial manufacturing got involved, you start seeing standardized versions of these tools. Someone realized there was a market for quality blackjacks. Someone else figured out how to manufacture weighted fist tools that could be sold as legitimate exercise equipment. This isn't historical accident. This is men creating legitimate markets for things that served another purpose. And then the bans started accelerating. Once the government realized what was happening, that men were finding ways to carry protection within the legal framework, they started closing those loopholes. By the 1930s, every state was moving toward either banning or heavily restricting the tools that mountain men had been carrying. But here's the thing, the tools weren't the problem. The problem was that men felt they needed them. And banning the tools didn't solve the underlying issue. It just pushed men toward finding new solutions. What's fascinating from a historical perspective is that this happened almost simultaneously across the country. It wasn't coordinated. There's no evidence of a federal effort to ban these items. Instead, it was individual states and municipalities responding to the same pressure. City police departments in the north were seeing brass knuckles used in urban street violence. Mountain communities in the south were watching the same tools being used in labor disputes. And legislators in both places reached similar conclusions. These tools needed to be restricted, but the story that matters isn't the law's response. It's why the tools were needed in the first place. And that's a story about economic power, about who gets protected by law and who doesn't, about what happens when the legal system stops being a mechanism of justice and becomes a mechanism of control. Mountain men didn't carry pocket weapons because they were criminals. They carried them because the law wasn't protecting them. And understanding that distinction is the key to understanding everything that followed. In the coal camps of Appalachia, there was no police force protecting the miners. There were company men. The mine owners hired their own security. Men who answered to the company payroll, not to any elected official or state law. When a dispute broke out over wages, working conditions, or union organizing, the law that arrived came in the form of armed guards employed by the same men who profited from keeping wages low. This wasn't justice, this was enforcement. A miner who wanted to protect himself couldn't call a sheriff. The sheriff worked for the same interests. He couldn't petition the government because the government had already decided whose side it was on, so he carried what he could carry legally: a roll of coins, a heavy buckle, a piece of rope, tools that had legitimate uses so ordinary that no one could arrest him for owning them. But if he needed to defend himself against a company enforcer twice his size, those ordinary tools became something else entirely. This is what historians miss when they talk about Appalachian weapons culture. They focus on the weapons themselves. But the real story is about a population that learned to exist in a legal grey zone because the law had already abandoned them. The tools were just the expression of that reality. By the 1930s, this tension had created something unique in American culture. Young men in the mountains grew up knowing that the legal system wasn't there to protect them. Their fathers and grandfathers had taught them that. So they learned to be resourceful. They learned what an ordinary object could do if you understood physics and timing. They learned to think about everyday items in terms of utility and defense. And they passed this knowledge down the same way they passed down recipes or family stories. But something else was happening too. The tools were evolving. What started as purely improvised weapons, taking something designed for one purpose and adapting it for another, began to transform into actual purpose-built items. And that's where the line between tool and weapon became harder to draw. Local blacksmiths weren't making rifles or military-grade weapons, but they were making brass knuckles. They were making saps with lead cores perfectly weighted for a single devastating blow. They were crafting leather sheaths for blades that were technically designed for cutting vegetation. The distinction between custom tool and custom weapon became purely semantic, and once you're in semantic territory, you're in legal territory. And the law was coming. What's remarkable is how slowly the laws actually came. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that most states began systematically outlawing these items, and even then the laws were often vague. How do you legally define a weapon that has genuine civilian applications? A blackjack could be used for self-defense, sure, but it could also be used by a security guard for the same purpose. Where's the legal line? The answer was that legislators simply drew the line wherever it was politically convenient. If an item had become associated with labor violence or street crime in urban areas, they banned it. If it was still common in rural areas where the people making the laws owned property, they often looked the other way. A Kentucky coal miner couldn't legally carry brass knuckles by the 1950s. But a wealthy businessman in Louisville could hire security guards with the exact same protective equipment, and that was perfectly legal. This is the pattern you see over and over in American legal history. Laws are written to criminalize the behavior of one group while protecting the privilege of another. And the mountain communities understood this instinctively. They knew that carrying a hidden weapon would eventually become illegal. They just didn't expect it to happen on such specific terms. Because here's what makes the Appalachian weapons story different from other American subcultures that developed alternative self-defense strategies. The mountain communities didn't hide what they were doing. These items were sold openly in stores. They were manufactured by known craftspeople. They were discussed in newspapers. There was no conspiracy. There was just a population that had learned to exist outside the protection of the law. And they were doing it openly. The company men knew about these items. The local police knew. The judges knew. For decades, everyone knew. And there was almost a collective agreement that as long as these things weren't being used to start trouble with strangers, they were acceptable. It was only when the cultural moment shifted, when labor movements became more organized, when crime rates rose in cities, when the social order began to feel threatened to those in power, that the crackdown came. And the crackdown was thorough. By the 1970s, most of these items had been made illegal across a significant portion of the country. Some states went further than others. Massachusetts outlawed brass knuckles in 1957. New York followed a few years later. Texas took longer, but eventually added saps and blackjacks to its prohibited weapons list. California banned them in 1994. And as the laws spread, the culture of open knowledge about these tools began to disappear. Younger generations in Appalachia didn't grow up with the same instruction in improvised defense. The knowledge was still there, passed down in quieter ways, but the openness was gone. You couldn't walk into a store and casually buy brass knuckles anymore. You couldn't ask a blacksmith to make you a weighted sap. The entire ecosystem that had sustained this culture had been dismantled. But something interesting happened. The knowledge didn't disappear. It transformed. And understanding that transformation is crucial to understanding how Appalachian self-defense culture actually survived the legal bans. Because once you understand the principles, once you know that a roll of coins works the same way as a brass knuckle because of physics and mass distribution, once you understand that any heavy object on a flexible extension becomes a more effective striking tool, once you grasp that the legal status of an item is completely separate from its practical utility, you don't need someone to hand you a weapon. You can make one from what's around you, and that's what happened. The culture didn't end. It went underground, not criminally underground, just privately underground. Fathers still taught sons the same lessons, but they did it quietly. They didn't advertise it. They didn't sell it. They just passed along the knowledge in the same way you might teach someone how to start a fire or tie a proper knot. It became part of the informal education of growing up in those communities. And this is where the story connects to something much larger about American self-reliance and what happens when communities stop trusting institutions to protect them. When the government decided to criminalize these tools, it didn't criminalize the thinking behind them. The mindset persisted, the belief that you should never be caught defenseless, that your safety is ultimately your responsibility, that legitimate tools could become legitimate weapons depending on intent. That worldview didn't disappear. It just became something people didn't discuss in polite company anymore. The brilliance of what those mountain communities understood was this. The most dangerous person in any confrontation isn't necessarily the one carrying the obviously threatening weapon. It's the person who understands that ordinary objects possess hidden potential. A piece of rope isn't a weapon until someone needs it to be. A piece of leather isn't a threat until circumstances change it into one. The law could ban brass knuckles, but it couldn't ban brass. It could ban certain knives, but it couldn't ban the principle of having something sharp, available when you needed it. This is what made the Appalachian approach fundamentally different from organized crime or street gang culture. Those communities weren't looking for weapons of terror or dominance. They were looking for ways to ensure that if violence came to them, and in those mining towns, it often did, they wouldn't be helpless. They couldn't afford to be helpless. The company hired armed men. The law often sided with the company, so ordinary men created solutions using ordinary things. And here's something most people don't understand about this period of American history. A significant portion of violence in those communities wasn't random street crime. It was organized labor violence. It was company security opening fire on miners. It was railroad detectives beating workers who tried to organize. The tools people carried weren't for mugging someone in an alley. They were for surviving encounters with people who had both institutional power and weapons. When a company guard walks toward you with a billy club and you know the law won't protect you, a roll of pennies in your pockets starts to look a lot less like random preparation and a lot more like reasonable self-preservation. The criminalization of these tools happened gradually, then suddenly. State by state, decade by decade, legislatures started passing laws that seemed reasonable on their surface. Brass knuckles were dangerous. Blackjacks were used by criminals. Certain knife designs were associated with gang activity, but what was actually happening was that lawmakers were creating a situation where law-abiding people in these communities had fewer and fewer options for practical self-defense. Here's the part that never gets discussed in mainstream history. The people who carried these tools often knew they were walking a legal grey line. They understood which state had which laws. They knew what would get them arrested and what wouldn't. They made calculated decisions. A man traveling through Kentucky might carry a blackjack, but leave it behind before crossing into West Virginia. A person in Tennessee might keep their walking stick legal length, but understand exactly how it could be used if necessary. This wasn't criminal behavior. This was practical, informed citizenship, making choices based on their specific legal situation. But the criminalization created something unexpected. It created a generation of people who inherited knowledge they couldn't legally use, who understood applications they couldn't legally discuss, who had been taught to be prepared in ways the law now forbade. So what did they do? They kept the knowledge alive anyway, not through formal instruction or written manuals. That would be documentation. They kept it alive through stories, through casual mention, through example. A father might casually mention to his son how a particular knot could be useful in certain situations, not saying when those situations might be, just mentioning the knot. A grandfather might show a grandchild how to properly throw a punch, explaining the importance of keeping your thumb outside your fingers, not mentioning that a roll of pennies would improve the result, just teaching good technique. A family member might point out how a particular tool worked best when gripped a certain way, or how surprising weight could be if you loaded something with the right materials. The knowledge persisted as practical skill rather than weaponcraft, and crucially, it persisted as something that could only be understood through context and experience. You couldn't read about it in a book without someone explaining what they meant. You couldn't watch it online without community knowledge making it meaningful. This made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to prosecute or prevent. How do you arrest someone for teaching proper punching technique? How do you criminalize teaching someone how to tie an efficient knot? This is where the story intersects with something we don't talk about enough in American history, the difference between criminal behavior and illegalized behavior. The difference between someone actually breaking the law to commit a crime and someone possessing something the government decided was too dangerous for civilians. Those mountain communities understood this distinction intuitively. They had lived through enough changes in what was and wasn't allowed to recognize that legality and morality weren't always aligned, and that's the foundation for understanding what happened next in this story. Because the criminalization didn't stop the practice, it just changed how people approached it. It made everything more subtle, more deniable, more integrated into ordinary life, in ways that are almost impossible to separate from normal behavior. A man carrying a walking stick can say he needs it for his knees. A woman wearing a heavy keyring on her belt can say it's just her keys. Someone carrying a flashlight of significant weight is just prepared for emergencies. The items are legal, the possession is legal, the applications might be creative, but they're not advertised, they're not discussed, they just exist, carried by people who understand what they could do if they ever became necessary. If you want to understand more about how these items were actually used in documented historical confrontations, there's actually a much deeper resource I've put in the description that breaks down the specific documented cases and how people defended themselves during some of the actual conflicts in these communities. This is what separates the Appalachian tradition from simple violence preparation. The tools and knowledge remained legal and practical. The teaching remained embedded in skill instruction rather than weapon training. The culture remained about preparedness rather than aggression. But the underlying philosophy never changed. You are responsible for your own safety. You should never be caught unprepared, and the tools you need for preparation are all around you if you know how to see them. That philosophy didn't die with the coal mines or disappear when highways replaced mountain roads. It lives in every person who still carries a knife for practical reasons, who keeps rope in their truck bed, who knows how to read a situation before it escalates. The difference between your grandfather's generation and ours is not the need for preparedness. The need never went away. The difference is that we've been taught to outsource our safety to institutions, to ask permission instead of taking responsibility. In the mountains, there was no police station on every corner. There were no security cameras. There was no 911 system that would reach you in 15 minutes. There was only you, your knowledge, and the tools available to you. When a young man asked his father how to handle a dangerous situation, the answer was never call someone. It was think ahead. understand your surroundings, and keep yourself sharp. That mentality created men and women who didn't panic under pressure because they had already imagined the scenario and mentally rehearsed the response. The legal pressure against improvised defensive tools tells you something important about how power structures operate. When a government fears that ordinary citizens might be self-reliant, when it views preparedness as a threat rather than a virtue, it begins to restrict the tools that enable independence. The coal mining companies didn't want armed miners who could stand up for themselves. The governments that followed didn't want mountain communities that could function without external authority, so they made rolls of coins illegal. They banned weighted gloves. They restricted the very items that allowed working people to take responsibility for their own security. But here's what they didn't account for. They couldn't ban knowledge. They couldn't outlaw the understanding that a walking stick can be wielded defensively. They couldn't restrict the principle that everyday objects have multiple purposes. And they certainly couldn't erase the cultural memory of what it meant to be truly prepared, truly independent, and truly responsible for yourself and your family. That's why this information matters now more than ever. Not because we're going to break laws or carry weapons we shouldn't, but because understanding how your ancestors thought about preparedness, about using available tools intelligently, and about maintaining independence, that understanding is a foundation for genuine self-reliance in whatever situation you might face. A person who understands that a walking stick has multiple legitimate purposes, who knows how to assess distance and angle, who thinks about their environment and positioning, that person is fundamentally different from someone who has outsourced all their safety concerns to others. The mountain people didn't develop these practices because they were violent or aggressive. They developed them because they lived in places where help might be hours away. They developed them because responsibility for safety couldn't be delegated. And they developed them with a specific ethical framework. The tools and knowledge should be proportional to the actual threat. The preparation should be practical rather than paranoid. And the mindset should remain defensive rather than predatory. That distinction separates a person who is truly prepared from a person who is simply dangerous. When you look at what made these communities strong, what allowed them to survive in genuinely difficult circumstances, it wasn't that they had better weapons. It was that they had better judgment. They understood context. They knew the difference between preparation and escalation. They could assess a situation and respond appropriately without letting emotion drive their decisions. Those capabilities still matter. They matter more in a world that's becoming increasingly unpredictable. If you want to understand this deeper, I've put together a much more comprehensive resource in the description and pinned comment that goes into the actual historical records, court cases, and documented incidents where these tools and tactics were deployed. I've also included information about how different states approached regulation of these items, and what that tells us about the relationship between government and citizen autonomy. That resource gets into specifics that I can't cover in a single video, but here's the fundamental truth that ties everything together. The reason Appalachian communities were so resilient wasn't because they had access to exotic weapons or secret techniques. It was because they lived according to principles of responsibility, preparedness, and intelligent self-reliance. Every tool had a legitimate everyday purpose. Every piece of knowledge served a practical function in a working life. And every cultural practice reinforced the idea that you cannot depend on others to keep you safe. That responsibility belongs to you. That's the inheritance worth preserving. Not the specific tools, many of which are rightfully restricted by modern law, but the mentality, the understanding that awareness is the first line of defense, that preparation is not paranoia, that independence and responsibility go hand in hand, that the tools you need are often already in your hands if you understand their full potential, that your safety is ultimately your responsibility, not something you can fully outsource or ignore. The men and women who carved out survival in these mountains weren't superhuman. They didn't have special powers or secret weapons. They had something more fundamental. They had a clear understanding of their own responsibility for their own security. They had knowledge that was practical and applicable. They had the judgment to know when preparation was necessary and when fear was unfounded. And they had a culture that reinforced these values across generations. We've strayed far from that framework. We've been told to fear self-reliance, to view preparedness as paranoia, to see our responsibility as something that should be transferred to authorities and institutions. But the mountains are still there. The principles that made those communities strong are still available to anyone willing to learn them. And the first step is understanding that What your ancestors knew about preparedness, responsibility, and intelligent defense isn't some obscure historical detail. It's foundational wisdom about how to live in an uncertain world. If you want to go deeper into the documented evidence of how these communities actually functioned, how they managed security and conflict, and what the historical record tells us about the effectiveness of their approach, check out the pinned comment in the description. I've included a full breakdown that takes this investigation much further than we can go here. You'll find everything you need to understand not just the tools, but the complete system of thinking that made Appalachian resilience legendary. Thank you for walking through this history with me. The stories of how ordinary people prepared themselves, how they took responsibility seriously, and how they built communities that could function without depending on distant institutions. These are stories worth knowing. If you're interested in forgotten American history, frontier knowledge, and the practical wisdom your ancestors possessed, please subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the next piece of hidden history. And if this resonated with you, leave a like and let me know in the comments what aspect of mountain preparedness culture surprised you most. I'll see you on the next